Welcome back, everyone, for yet another interesting session in the database design series. So, today, as promised in the last video, we are going to identify entities, attributes, and relationships for our case study, the online tutoring system. So, in our last video, we introduced the case study and we went through the business rules in detail and even identified the entities and the relationships in a higher level. So, today we are going to do an assignment where we are going to list down the entities, attributes, relationships, primary key, and the foreign keys involved in this particular case study. Are you ready for the discussion? That's perfect. Okay, so now let us see how to take it forward. I have given you the template of how we are going to take this. So what we are going to do is that for each entity, we are going to give the entity name. We are going to include the attributes, relationship, primary key or keys, and then the foreign keys. Okay, and on the left hand side of this video, I've kept our original case study, and on the right hand side, we are going to prepare this document. So I just kept them hand in hand so that it'll be easy for us. So now let us go with the first one. So in the last video, we just mentioned that your student tutor session and the payment are going to be the entities as well, right? So let us start with the student first. So when you talk about the student, what are going to be the attributes? So when you talk about the attributes, remember the unique identifier is not a valid column name. Unique identifier tells you that you need a column which is going to be unique and not null. And here, when you talk about student, that is going to be the student ID, right? So it is going to be the student ID. Then we have the name, email, password, address, and phone number. Okay, so when it comes to your column names, make sure they don't have a space in between. If you wanted to split the words, you can use an underscore, but don't have a space in your column names. That is not allowed. And now, so attributes are identified. Then coming on to the primary key, the unique identifier that we specify is going to be the primary key. I am going to post yet another video explaining what is a primary key and what's a foreign key. But to give you a high level overview on that, primary key is recommended for every single table we have. It is not mandatory, but still it is recommended. And primary keys are the unique column in your table which uniquely identifies each record. The column will have only unique values, no duplicates, and no null values. Okay, and here we already said the student ID is the unique identifier. So the student ID is going to be my primary key for the entity student. Now, coming on to the relationships. So, from the first line, we identified the primary key, we identified the attributes. Now, moving on to the second line, students can enroll in multiple sessions. So, this clearly indicates a relationship between student and the session. Correct? So, we can say student and session have what kind of a relationship? So let us try to quickly draw a diagram and understand how we think it is right. Okay, so when you talk about this, now we get that you have a student and we have the session, correct? So they just mention students can enroll in multiple sessions. So which means that one student can take part in multiple sessions. And how about one session? One session, it could be a group class or a one-on-one. So if it is a group class, then yes, it involves multiple students, right? So this is clear that the student and session have a many to many relationship, many to many relationship. And one thing I wanted to tell you, when you have a many to many relationship, representing them in the table and having it normalized is going to be difficult. For that reason, when you have a many to many relationship, you always intend to break that relationship into two one to many relationships. How is that going to be possible? That is possible with the help of an associative entity. So, what we do here is when you talk about the student, so since one student can take part in many sessions, I bring in an intermediate entity to represent the relationship. Let me call that as enrollment. And then the session. So basically, between the student and session, I am bringing in an associative entity to break this many to many relationship. So now how are we going to do this? So one student can be enrolled in many sessions, but one enrollment belongs to only one student. Am I right? Now, in the same way, one enrollment will be there for one particular session, but one session can have many enrollments. So now if you see, the student enrollment has become a one-to-many relationship and enrollment session has become a many-to-one relationship. So why we need to break your many-to-many to this to one-to-many relationship? It is to make your keys get structured better. So we will talk about this in the video that we are going to release next on the primary key and foreign key relationships. Okay, so but for now, I hope you understand that a many to many relationship, if there, it has to be split into two relationships with an associative entity in between. So that is what we have done here. And in the assignment, let us also make this clear that we are breaking it up. So student and session have many to many relationship. This many to many relationship is broken down into two one-to-many relationships with the new associative entity called enrollment. So here we can say student to enrollment is one-to-many relationship, and similarly enrollment to session is many to one relationship. Is this clear to you? Perfect. Okay, let me just slightly reduce the font size so that it'll look good. Okay, now coming back to the next line in our business rule. So the next line says a student must pay the full session fee before attending. So when you talk about fees, it means we are talking about the relationship of student with the payment. So now when you talk about student and payment. And so one student can make many payments because the student can enroll in multiple sessions. But one payment will always correspond to one student. Correct? So student to payment relationship is going to be a one to many relationship. So let us record that here. Student and payment have one to many relationship. Okay, so now we have successfully mentioned all those attributes, relationships, primary key. The foreign key, I am going to postpone it for now. In this video, let us first do the entities, attributes, relationships, and primary key. If time permits, let's do the foreign key in this video, or we will add it to our primary key foreign key video. Okay, so now moving on to the next entity. So my next entity is going to be the tutor. Correct. So when you talk about this next entity, the tutor, let us get into the attributes of it. So when you go with the attributes, so the business rule has kept it easy for us. So the unique identifier again, we are going to give it as tutor ID, name, email, address, phone number, using underscore, areas of expertise. Done. The next thing that we are going to talk about is relationships, and even before that, we now know what is the primary key for this particular thing. It is going to be tutor ID. So let us put the tutor ID as the primary key because the tutor ID is going to be unique for each tutor. There will be a unique tutor ID and there cannot be any tutors without a tutor ID. It's a mandatory field, so it's unique and not null. So it's very clear that tutor ID is going to be the primary key. Is that clear to you? Fine. So now moving on to the relationship. So I came up with all the attributes based on the first business rule, which tells you what all attributes you have. Now moving on to the second one, it says tutors can conduct multiple sessions. So when you say tutors can conduct multiple sessions, it is very clear about what are the participating entities in the relationship. Can you tell me what are the participating entities? What is your first entity? Right. It is going to be the tutor. Now, what is the second participating entity here? Right. It is the session. And then what does the business rule say? It says tutors can conduct multiple sessions. So one tutor is going to have multiple sessions. How about one session? One session will be taken by one tutor. How do you know that? That is what is given in the next line. A session must be assigned to one and only one tutor. So this means your minimum and maximum both are one. So we will do that min-max cardinality when we are drawing the ER diagram for it. Okay. So now, like for this level to identify the relationships, we don't have to drill it to the min-max level. So now it is evident that one tutor can have multiple sessions. So we have put an N on the session side, and one session can have one and only one tutor. So we have put one on the tutor side. So this is a one-to-many relationship. Now let us go ahead and record this relationship here. So let me move on. Okay. Tutor session has one-to-many tutoring session have one-to-many relationship, right? Okay, so that's the only business rule that's given. So let us leave it there. And again, coming on to foreign keys, as I told you, I'm going to leave it blank for now. Okay. So now coming on to the next one. The next entity is going to be your session. So if you come here, okay, the next entity is going to be session. And now you know what we have to do next. Yes, we are going to talk about the attributes, relationships, primary keys. Okay, attributes, it's clearly specified. It is going to be a unique, I'm sorry. So we are, yeah, we are in the session. So it's going to be unique identifier, schedule, duration, fee, and description. So what is this schedule? If you look at this business rule, it tells you that sessions must have a defined start date and end date. So the schedule actually refers to this start date and end date. So, and unique identifier. So let us keep it the session ID. Okay. So it is going to be session ID and then start date, end date, duration, fee, description. And one more thing, keep your table names singular, keep your attributes singular. Okay, if your attribute is really going to store multiple information in it, that is when we can keep it plural. See here, so in areas of expertise, one tutor can have multiple areas of expertise or multiple subjects that they are proficient in teaching. In that case is where I've used the plural. Whereas if you look at the tutor and look at the attributes, the tutor ID, name, email, address, everything we kept it singular. Why? Because you're going to store only one value in it at a time. And in a tutor entity, each row is going to identify a unique tutor. Okay, so just try to keep your table names and column names singular unless otherwise your column names are going to store multiple values in it. Okay, fine. So now we have identified the attributes of your session. The next thing is the relationships, and even before that, I don't know why tutor ID is getting auto-corrected. So now in primary key, we know what is it. What is the primary key for session? Very good. It is going to be the session ID. Okay. Now coming on to the relationships. Okay. So let us see what other information they've given in the business rule. A session is conducted by one tutor. Session is conducted by one tutor, which is going to be this relationship, but can have multiple students enrolled. Okay, so this one talks about two relationships. One is between the session and the tutor, and the second one is between the session and the students enrolled. Okay, and if you see session and tutor, we have already mentioned it here. So this will be the first one they are talking about, and session and the student, this is the second one. So though we already mentioned it in our assignment document, we have to still mention it in the sessions perspective. The only difference is when you wrote in the tutor, you said tutor and session have a one-to-many relationship, correct? Now you have to write it in a sessions perspective. So you will say session and tutor have many-to-one relationship. Am I right? Because one session can be done by only one tutor, and one tutor can give multiple sessions. So there will be many sessions to one tutor. That is why it is a many to one relationship. Similarly, the student and the session, we already marked it here. And this again, it talks about your enrollment table and everything that we discussed. So let us put it here. And so we just have to write everything in a sessions perspective. So we will say session and student have many to many relationship. This many to many relationship is broken down into two one to many, and you have to think about the student to enrollment and enrollment to session. So enrollment to session, so we can call it as, leave it as enrollment to session or make it as session to enrollment. So in that case, if we are doing it as session to enrollment, right, then it will be one to many relationship. One session can have many enrollments. Since we decided to keep it all in sessions perspective, since it is a session entity, I've changed that. Okay, and this is part of this relationship. Okay, is there anything else that we have to think about? Sessions must have a defined start and end date. That is why we removed the schedule, and rather than removed, we just mentioned schedule to be your start date, end date. And then each session must be fully paid by the student before attendance. So this clearly talks about session and the payment. So that is some relationship that we have not come up with so far. So let us do that here. So when you talk about session and the payment, so when you talk about it, they said each session must be fully paid, which means there are no installments. Your payment is going to be a one-time activity for a session. Correct? So one session will have only one payment, and one payment will correspond to only one session. So this means that your session and payment is going to be a one-to-one relationship. So let us record it here. Session and payment have one-to-one relationship. Okay, that's it. We have addressed all the points given regarding the session. So that is clear to us now. Now we can move on to the last one, which is going to be your payment. Okay, so after that, we will see if there are any other entities that we have to identify. And I am going to leave the foreign keys blank for now. Okay, unless otherwise you don't have a foreign key for the particular table, you cannot leave it blank. Okay, now coming on to the next entity that we are going to talk about, so that is your payment entity. Okay, so now under payment, let us talk about the attributes. How is this session going on? Is it understandable to you all? I hope so. Okay, so now coming on to the attributes. So again, it's going to be everything that's mentioned here. So unique identifier, let us call it as payment ID here. And then it is going to be, okay, why student ID, session ID? Actually, I gave you a clue here. So these will move on to the foreign keys, but I'm not going to talk about it in detail now. So we have the student ID, we have the session ID, because when you talk about a payment, for what are you doing the payment? For a particular student, for a particular session, correct? So amount, date, oh, I forgot to give date and then payment method. Okay, so now moving further, we know what the primary key is going to be. So the primary key, the unique not null value, that is going to be your payment ID. So let me put the primary key to be the payment ID, and foreign keys we will leave it for now. Coming further into your relationships. Okay, so what clues we have about the relationships here? Each payment, so this one it is done. Now payments are linked to a specific session, specific student. So this again means that there are two relationships indicated here between the payment and the session, between the payment and the student. Okay, so now if you see payment and the session, we already have it here. Payment and the student also we have it here. So let us do it from the perspective of payment rather than from student and session. So we will say payment. I don't want it to be bold. Okay, payment and session have one-to-one relationship. We have already discussed on it. And then payment to student, you could see that payment is your many side and student is your one side, right? So payment to student have many to one relationship. It's pretty straightforward. Now, coming on to the next one, payments must be made in full for the session before the session begins. Right, so that tells you that the session and payment have the cardinality of one to one. Okay, so now so we are towards the end of the case study document that we had. So does that mean we have listed all the entities that are needed? Not really. Not really? What does it mean then? Do we have any other entities that we have to list? Yes. When you have an associative entity called enrollment, this becomes a separate entity by itself. And when we move on to ER diagram and then to tables, this enrollment becomes a brand new table in your database. So here again, it becomes an entity by itself. Though we call it an associative entity, it is an entity by itself. So now I will go ahead and create my fifth entity called enrollment. So if you are also doing a case study, just make sure that you don't list only the primary entities. You will also list the associative entities as entities too. Is that clear? Okay. So now coming on to this associative entity, what will be the attributes and then what will be the relationship and what will be the primary key and the foreign keys. This is little interesting because for all others, we got to know the attributes from the business rules directly. Whereas here, this is one table that we ourselves came up with. In that case, they would not give you any of the business rules associated with it, and we are going to do that. So, how are we going to do it? Okay, so now when you talk about enrollment, so this enrollment, it is an associative entity. The entity cannot stand by itself because it is a relationship table kind of thing. It came out, it evolved from a relationship, so it cannot stand by itself. There are two ways of handling it. Okay, so whatever happens, the primary keys from both the participating entities are going to be my attributes. So we know that for enrollment, it is a relationship table or associative entity formed between student and session. Correct? So my student ID will be an attribute. My session ID will be an attribute. And then if there are any specific fields or any specific attributes that is more focused towards this relationship, if the attribute cannot stand on a student side or session side, but it can stand only on the enrollment, then you will put them here. Like say for example, enrollment date. So when did the student enroll for the session? So now think about it. Can we put this enrollment date in the student? If you put an enrollment date in the student, which enrollment date are we talking about? The student might participate in almost 10 sessions. Then this enrollment date, when you put it on the student side, it's going to have 10 different dates. So that is not possible. Okay. Can I put the enrollment date as an attribute in my session entity? Then which enrollment date I'm talking about? A session can be enrolled by multiple students. So if I have 20 students participating in a group session, then if I put the enrollment date in the session entity, then I have to mention the 20 enrollment dates of all 20 students. So that doesn't look straightforward. So the best place to put the supporting attribute specific to this relationship in your relationship table. So that is why when you put enrollment date, now it is very clear. It is the enrollment date of this particular student in this particular session. Okay. Likewise, when you have an associative entity formed, you just check what all additional fields the relationship would need. Those fields you can make them as attributes here. Okay, now coming on to the next interesting information, your primary key. So, when you talk about a primary key for an associative entity, you have two different possibilities. What could they be? One thing, just like all other tables, we can pick a unique identifier for my enrollment. So, when I say unique identifier, it could be the enrollment ID. If you're doing it that way, then your primary key is going to be the enrollment ID. There is another option. So, how did we form this enrollment? It's based on the student and session. So, I can make the student ID and the session ID together as a primary key. So this is something interesting. Can we have multiple attributes as primary keys? What do you think? Okay. So when you cannot have two primary keys in a table. That is not possible. A table or an entity can have only one primary key. Then how can this combo be possible? It is possible by making it a composite primary key. So when I make a composite primary key, it doesn't mean that my student ID alone or session ID alone makes sense. It's the combination of student ID and session ID. Just think about it. Can I have student ID alone as a primary key in the enrollment table? What if my student attends 10 different sessions? Then I'll have 10 records for the student in the enrollment table. So if I put student ID alone, it will not be unique. So it can't be the primary key. The same thing for session ID. For one session, there could be 20 students participating in it. So I cannot have session ID alone as a primary key in the enrollment because one session can have n number of students. So the only way is to make it a combination. So student ID, session ID combinations together has to be unique and not null. So one student will attend a session only once. He is not going to attend the same session multiple times, right? So taking that into consideration, we can make this to be the composite primary key. So these are the two options of making your primary key. I would prefer to go with a composite primary key here, but either way is fine. Okay, so I am not adding an enrollment ID. Instead, because I just wanted to show you the composite primary key is valid too. So I'll have the student ID, session ID as a composite primary key. Okay, coming on to the relationship, we already came up with the relationship. It is enrollment to student and enrollment to session. So here we have two things. One is enrollment to student is many to one. Many enrollments can be there for one student as many to one relationship, and also enrollment to session is many to one relationship. Is this clear to you? And you might think that we are having redundancy in this document. Redundancy means repeating the same stuff over and over again. I do agree to it because the same relationships it is placed when you have a relationship with two entities, we are placing that relationship twice in this document, one on the first entity side and the other on the second entity side, but I would say it is fine. It is fine because by organizing it this way, we will be clear about the relationships, and there are very few chances we are going to skip them in the ER diagram. So that is totally fine. I would say this template is much more cleaner and straightforward, but if you wanted to have your own template, I'm fine with that as well. But just make sure that all these informations are there. And as I told you, like we are yet to discuss about the foreign keys, and I would like to postpone that discussion to a separate video. The reason being, I wanted to keep my videos little shorter so that students can find time. Once when they start a video, they can finish it off. Okay, so you can expect two more videos from me regarding this particular discussion. One video, it's a simple video explaining what is primary key and what's a foreign key. And then another video, which is a continuity of this case study, wherein we will identify the foreign keys for each of these entities, associated with each of these entities. Okay, so now to give you a recap of what all we did today, we just took our case study. We started with a blank document, and in that document, we just made sure that we just created the bunch of entities, attributes in each entities. In attributes, and we made sure that unique identifier is replaced with valid column names, and then we listed all the relationships. When we list the relationships, we did not put the same line as in business rule. In this document, our intention is not to explain about how two entities are connected, what is the purpose of the relationship and all that. We have to be straightforward. We have to say the entities and what type of relationship. If you didn't watch the video on cardinality ratio, go and watch it. I've clearly explained what is one to one, one to many to many relationship. Okay, so here in this document, we are representing the participating entities and the type of cardinality involved in the relationship. And one important thing that we learned is if there is a many to many relationship, it is recommended to break them into two one to many relationships. And how to do it? We will bring in a intermediate associative entity, which is going to be more like a table or entity to replace this relationship. So likewise, between student and session, we had a many to many relationship. We are breaking that into student, enrollment, and session. So we break the student session many to many relationship into two one to many relationships, one between student and enrollment, the other between enrollment and session. So that is what we have documented here. And with the business rules as the clues, we are identifying all the relationships in place. And whatever unique identifier we had, we use that as our primary key. And similarly, we did it for the tutor session and payment. And one additional entity that we came up with is the associative entity, which is your enrollment. And how do we identify the attributes of enrollment? The primary keys of both the strong entities, the student and session, those become the key as well as attributes in your enrollment table. So we had student ID, session ID, and whatever attributes are unique to this relationship, the enrollment date here. So we have included all those and we have drafted the relationship and the primary key. When it comes to primary key, you can create a unique identifier for enrollment called enrollment ID and use it as a primary key, or You can have the primary key of both the entity student and session as a composite primary key here. Okay, so hope you understood this video and hope it was useful to you. I'll see you soon in yet another video. Stay tuned and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.